Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Sunday, April 20th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. Hi, David. How you doing?
Hey, Jessica. How you doing?
Hey there. It is day 562 of the war. An Israeli soldier was killed in a Hamas attack in Gaza. His name was Galeb Sliman al-Nassara. 5 others were hurt together in the northern Gaza Strip on Saturday afternoon. Al-Nassara from the Bedouin city of Rahat was the first soldier killed in Gaza since the end of the ceasefire on March 18th. This morning, hostage families went to the border with Gaza from Kibbutz Nir Oz. They're there calling for their loved ones to be freed, telling their loved ones through microphones to stay strong. And that's all as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Saturday night that he will not surrender to Hamas by ending the war to get back the hostages, and that fighting won't end until the terror group is destroyed. We'll discuss those issues, those headlines, as well as the results of Saturday's nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran, and the latest in the Qatargate affair, as lawyers for one of the main suspects is going up against the Prime Minister's spokesperson. Stay with us. Okay, so David, as of last night, as of yesterday, we had a new Hamas video from hostage Elkanah Buchbut begging to be released, begging to be brought home. We have, as I said, the families at the Kibbutz Nir Oz border calling out to their loved ones. The father of hostage Idan Alexander in the States, he is in the States, calling for direct talks with Hamas. And we have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who vowed last night that he will not end the war with Hamas until the terror group is removed from power. So a lot of different things playing out on that front. And the Prime Minister's big announcement last night, what do we think was the purpose of that? What did you see in that announcement, in that statement of his?
Right. Well, he had said before Shabbat that he was going to be making a significant diplomatic announcement, which was the assumption was it would relate to the Gaza war, Hamas, the hostages, and to Iran, or some or all of those things. And indeed, it did relate to all of those things to some extent. But I suppose if we're supposed to understand this as some kind of major announcement, the takeaway is that the war is not going to end anytime soon, that he's not prepared to do the deal that has been widely urged, including a lot of protest letters, which is even at the cost of ending the war, do a deal to get all the hostages out. So I think that's the key takeaway. He's not going to agree to that equation, and he made a very protracted argument about why he couldn't do that, because Hamas will, if you leave Hamas able to recover, it will rearm and it will attack again, and he can't allow that to happen. I think what was also interesting, he made the strongest explanation that he's delivered to date about why he doesn't think that the notion that he could agree to a deal and agree to stop the war and get the hostages back, but then resume fighting is tenable. He was derisive of that notion, and people in his circle, shall we say, have explained the reasoning that he delivered last night. But I think it was the first time that he'd given them a very detailed reasoning. And the bottom line is, as he says, he can't trick Hamas because the international community won't let him. And of course, Hamas knows that that's something that's being suggested. And as he put it, they're not stupid. They're not idiots. His point being, that the argument has been made, okay, Hamas is demanding an end to the war. And then it says, if you agree to that and you pull the IDF out, we will release all the hostages and return all the bodies of slain hostages. And people have been suggesting, okay, so go for that. It's not as though Hamas will not provide endless pretexts afterwards to necessitate, or not pretexts, endless reasons to necessitate a return to the fighting. And he basically said, I don't think he specified last night. Oh, he did actually. UN Security Council members, he said, wouldn't allow that. His point being, he said Hamas is seeking all kinds of guarantees, and among them, it has been suggested elsewhere, is they'll want some kind of binding UN Security Council resolution that ends the war. And obviously, the United States would be interested in getting the hostages back, and Israel would be agreeing to this deal, so the US would vote for such a resolution. But the argument that's been put to him is, okay, and afterwards you resume the fighting because Hamas rearms or smuggles stuff in or fires rockets, and everyone will say, of course you can do that. And there's a very sympathetic American administration. His point last night is that's not how things work. If, for example, such a resolution was passed at the UN, you couldn't rescind it because the likes of Russia and China would not agree to accept a subsequent resolution that would supersede the one that they've all voted for. And then you would have, as he put it, no international legitimacy for resuming the war. That's, I don't think that's an argument he's made with that kind of detail in the past. But the bottom line is he's not ending the war. He won't do a deal that ends the war for the hostages. And the response of the families of the hostages was very bleak. Because so then what's the plan? What's the plan? And their concern was heightened by the fact that his spokesman was on television earlier in the evening saying there's no possibility of a single deal that gets out all the hostages. The other half of that is, we're trying for some kind of partial deal. And that ties into something that two parents who met with Ron Dermer recently, who's Netanyahu's key strategist or the person overseeing the hostage talks now, and they were incredibly upset. They are two parents who come from the part of the spectrum, I suppose, that is broadly supportive of the government. There's something called the Tikva Forum, which until recently, at least, you know all about this, was saying we shouldn't negotiate with Hamas. And, the only way to get people out is when Hamas is defeated or is it by defeating Hamas and so on. I don't want to misrepresent what they stand for. But in this letter that they wrote up, they had a 2-hour meeting with Ron Dermer. And first of all, they said he just didn't stop talking. He wouldn't stop talking and he wouldn't answer. We could barely ask him questions. But they wrote a quite remarkable thing in the letter, which was their sense that because they have been so supportive of the government, they've been among the families who have been supportive of the government, that they actually may be discriminated against by the government, that their loved ones may not be included in a partial deal because the government knows that they won't make too much of a fuss. Again, I'm paraphrasing, and that's not exactly the thrust. But it reflects this growing dismay. I mean, it's never not been there, but growing dismay that their loved ones are, every day is life-threatening for them. And the Hostage Families Forum, the main forum, was saying, you're not telling us what you're going to do. How are you going to get these people out? We can be, battering Hamas for the foreseeable future. The army now, I think it's saying that it controls something like 30% of Gaza. The campaign has been resumed.
And a soldier was killed and injuries.
Right. And how are you going to get the hostages back? That's what they're asking with increasing bafflement, dismay, and despair.
So, okay. Here we are this week again. And in fact, those two families who met with Ron Dermer are in fact not at the Gaza border with Kibbutz Nir Oz right now, because that's not the kind of thing that they do, as you just laid out. I know that there's protests planned throughout the week, all day long, every day in different locations. I don't know. Where do we see this? Where do we see these families taking their pain and anguish at this point beyond what they can do?
Well, they will continue to protest, and we've heard, I think, more clearly than in the past from the Prime Minister that not that he's indifferent, quite the reverse. He says it's heartbreaking what they're going through, and it's not his fault, that he's done everything, he is doing everything, that many hostages have been brought back. He said last night that he said in one of the early security cabinet meetings, possibly the first one, he said, there was a very senior security official who said, I think we need to come to terms with the fact that we may not get any hostages back at all. And then Netanyahu gave the figures for how many have indeed been brought back and asserted that it's only the combination of military pressure and diplomacy that has yielded the release of hostages in the past and that will do so in the future. That's the line. Now, there are people who are very skeptical of even Netanyahu's motivations and believe, as many of the hostage families do, and as is the theme of many of the demonstrations, that there's a narrow political motivation here, that he knows he doesn't have a coalition majority without continuing the war, because two coalition parties, the far-right parties, one of them bolted and came back, and both had threatened repeatedly to leave him and to deprive him of his majority if he ends the war with Hamas not destroyed. So that's the framework. And then there's the question of how exactly do you destroy Hamas? This is not some kind of theoretical issue. Netanyahu last night said, if we leave Hamas in power, then we can't implement Trump's vision for a whole different Gaza. But Trump's vision and nothing that Netanyahu has said, neither of them explain quite how Hamas is going to be utterly destroyed. The idea of the hostility to Israel, the ambition to wipe Israel out that is at the heart of Hamas's ideology, is not unsupported even among people who are not, paid up members of the Hamas fighting force. Trump never really explained how you distinguish between the wonderful people of Gaza, who he says he would encourage to relocate, and Hamas, which he backs Israel in seeking to eradicate. It's a shame to sort of keep going over issues that we've talked about for 18 months, of course, but they remain at the heart of the dilemmas facing Israel, of the rend in Israel about, got to make sure Hamas can't attack us again, but we have to get these people back. In many cases, by the way, are people who were abducted defending Israel. And if they weren't, they were abducted while being Israelis in Israel. What, you just leave them behind? So it's the same dilemma, and it's the dilemma that stems from Hamas's exceptionally cynical strategy of abducting lots and lots of people and using them as leverage with the goal of surviving the inevitable Israeli response to their invasion and slaughter.
It brings us to this moment. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we're back, we'll talk about Tehran and Qatargate. Okay, so talks again yesterday between the U.S. and Iran in Italy. They're now moving forward. Expert level meetings, as we've reported, are planned for Wednesday in Oman. And I spoke to Laser about this. I've spoken to you about this. As this moves forward, what do we think it means for Israel in terms of what's really on the table at this point?
Well, we don't know exactly what this deal will involve, but it's, at the very least, I think you have to say, pretty worrying. Not because Israel does not want a deal that deprives Iran of a path to nuclear weapons, but because I think Israel, myself certainly included, are worried about whether the American side of these negotiations is as up to speed and as expert as it would need to be in negotiating with the very cynical leadership of Iran, which wants to destroy Israel and wants to have the potential to break out to the bomb, which already, it's close and already gives it significant weight in the region, and wants to move forward. In other words, I don't think that there are very many people in Israel who believe that Iran is genuinely ready to give up its goal of attaining nuclear weapons. And yet, after 2 rounds of talks, we are told by the Iranians, I'm not sure that the Americans have yet confirmed this, but they haven't denied it, 4 days from now, they're going to start drafting a deal. Now, the person who President Trump charged with overseeing this, the ubiquitous Steve Witkoff, who's also trying to resolve the Russian war on Ukraine and solve issues in Gaza and the hostage issues, in which he's definitely very personally invested. He's overseeing the Iran talks, and he came out of the previous session making remarks about how, indicating that there was an American willingness not to dismantle Iran's facilities, but to limit Iran to civilian levels of uranium enrichment with verification on issues relating to weaponization. If I were the Iranians, having listened to that initial Steve Witkoff interview, I think that I was in a pretty good place, and I've got this guy wrapped around my finger, and he really doesn't quite understand who he's dealing with. And then the next day, he kind of walked that back a bit and said, of course, their nuclear facilities, or he used the word eliminate. But then after one more round of talks, hey, we're moving on to drawing up the deal. Now, that would be great if, I think I'll speak for myself, if Witkoff in his interviews had said, the only deal we're going to make is a deal that eliminates all of Iran's facilities, and they can have no enrichment capabilities, and they all have to be smashed apart, and there has to be full access for UN inspectors everywhere, not only known sites, but anywhere that they decide that there is some concern. If there had been a strident and unequivocal insistence on terms that would reasonably at least seek to ensure that Iran can't trick anybody, one would feel more comfortable. Instead, you've had the initial kind of soft line interview, then the hard line interview, then another round of talks, and wow, they're drawing up the deal. So either those Americans have really been duped, or wow, those Iranians have proved unexpectedly compromising. The Omani take on this, I should just say, was the latter. That, hey, this is, no nuclear stuff in Iran. Was a statement that came out of the Omani mediators yesterday. I don't hear the Iranians saying that. And therefore, unless or until one knows that the deal that's taking shape is one that denies Iran any kind of nuclear capabilities whatsoever, I think there's room for a lot of concern.
Okay. Obviously, we'll wait for Wednesday on that at this point in time.
I was going to say, I don't think they're going to wrap this up on Wednesday, but on the other hand, I didn't think they were going to be saying we're going to be starting to draw up the deal on Wednesday. So
exactly. Did you think it was going to be quite this fast? So
I did not quite this fast, and not on these apparent terms.
For sure. All right, let's take a quick look at Qatargate. The latest little, not so little, but essentially like a spat that was reported upon. We have the lawyer for the accused, Eli Feldstein, who had acted as a spokesperson for the Prime Minister's office. He is now up against a current spokesperson for the Prime Minister's office who is saying that Feldstein was actually not a spokesperson for so long. Remember, Feldstein is reminding our listeners, is one of two people who was accused of taking financial help, aid, money from Qatar. But basically, overall, what I think we're really seeing here is the Prime Minister's office trying to distance itself from Eli Feldstein. That's really what it looks like when you sort of take a step back. And obviously, this is something that's playing out, and it will keep on playing out, I imagine, for quite a while. But do we think this represents anything?
Well, it's an increasingly overt face-off between somebody who was a spokesman for the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office, and by extension, therefore, of course, Netanyahu himself. And the contention by his spokesman, quite atypically actually went on television for quite an extensive interview last night, and among other things said that Feldstein wasn't working for Netanyahu for months before this whole Qatargate saga ostensibly began, and an incredibly vociferous and firm denial by Feldstein's lawyers saying, the fact that he was working for Netanyahu and that he was working at Netanyahu's office's instruction is documented all over the place and utterly unarguable. And it has wider implications for all kinds of reasons, but including the fact that Ronen Bar, who's the not yet fired, but in theory fired, head of the Shin Bet, has contended that, and Netanyahu has contested, that the Qatargate saga is part of the whole context in which he was fired, that he had to investigate because there was things that needed to be investigated that related to allegations that people in the Prime Minister's office were working paid for Qatar, and that Netanyahu is so worried about this investigation that that's one of the main motivations why he was fired. Again, a timeline that Netanyahu has contested and so on, but therefore it's not an isolated alleged scandal, which is pretty dramatic in and of itself. The notion that people working with the Prime Minister were actually working for a foreign government, not an enemy government, but certainly a problematic government. And the question of whether this relates to the unprecedented dismissal of the head of the Domestic Security Service, which is being argued in the Supreme Court at the moment, whether that's legal, whether that can go ahead. We should add that there are reports now that Ronen Bar, who had said he was going to resign anyway because of the failures surrounding October the 7th, is reported now to be readying to resign in about 3 weeks from now. We'll see if that comes to pass. He's filing a statement to the court, I think, tomorrow. So all these elements continue to move forward with lots of argument, and really this I think it's fair to say, unprecedented rift between the Prime Minister's office, the highest echelon of the Israeli political leadership, and the Shin Bet, which is, this central security apparatus. This lack of crisis of faith, which also, takes us back to the first thing we talked about, the hostages. Ronen Bar has asserted really that Netanyahu has not been genuine in some of the efforts to achieve agreements on to get hostages out. wrote in a letter that he set up this mechanism to get hostages free, and now has come to wonder whether Netanyahu was really interested in doing everything that could be done to get the hostages free. So all of these things are intertwined.
And very hard to unravel it, for sure, at the moment. Okay, I think we're going to leave it for now, because that's where we've gotten to. Right, David?
That's where we've gotten to for now. Absolutely, Jess.
Thanks, David. Thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Any comments that you have, you can always email us at podcast@timesofisrael.com. And of course, feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care. Shavua Tov. Have yourselves a good week.